Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. So once again, we have got to the 23rd of April, and we've got a good excuse to make a special point of celebrating Shakespeare and his work as we mark his birthday and his passing. As you probably know by now, this year, 2023, is also the 400th anniversary of the printing of the first Folio edition of his collected plays, which is now regarded as one of the most important books in the history of printing, and something that was instrumental in creating the reputation that Shakespeare has now. One way in which that anniversary is being celebrated is with the release of a filmed version of Shakespeare Unbound, a one-man play about John Hemmings, the editor of the first folio, Shakespeare, and how the first folio came into being, researched, written and performed by Colin David Reese. Colin spoke to me at the end of February about his play and the first folio, which you can still find on the podcast feed or on the website if you missed it. Colin has a lifetime experience of acting and studying Shakespeare, and we spoke at length about not only the first folio, but how Colin has come to see and understand Shakespeare from an actor's point of view. If you'd like to find out more about Colin and his work, and get access to that filmed version of Shakespeare Unbound, you can find all the details that you need at the website www.shakespeareunbound.com. And I've put a link to that in the show notes. When I spoke with Colin from his home in France over Zoom, I was keen to get his thoughts not just on Shakespeare the man, but on the world of theatre that he operated in. It's not surprising that our conversation was quite wide-ranging on theatrical and Shakespearean subjects, given that both Shakespeare's influence and Colin's research and experience reach far and wide. From the influence of Commedia dell'arte to Brecht, from Peter Shaffer and Mozart to Gone with the Wind. It seems to me that this illustrates how Shakespeare, Shakespeare's study, and the historiography of Shakespeare remain very vibrant subjects. But as you will hear, Colin is always keen to point out the impact of the plays in the theatre as plays to be performed, and not just to be studied as literature and picked over on the page. My thanks once again to Colin for making time to speak to me. We started by discussing the plot sheets and cue sheets that were in common use in the Elizabethan theatre. These were sheets that contained the cues and entrances and exits for one actor's parts in the play. It seems surprising to us that actors worked from these, rather than a full script of the play, so that they could see the totality of the piece. How could just seeing one set of entrances and exits and cues not be horribly confusing? I asked Colin if, as an experienced actor, he found the approach surprising.
Oh, it blew me away. Absolutely. I mean, it's, I was standing there. If we go back to the moment when I went to Dulwich College to look at these, where they have these documents, I was standing there with a cue script in one hand and a plot sheet in the other, and having understood that they performed 150 plays a year, and as a professional performer, everything screamed at me, this is completely impossible. This simply cannot be done. And then I had done some research into Commedia dell'arte, and while I was standing there, I had one of those St. Paul on the road to Damascus epiphany moments. Shiver ran down my spine. And I said, "Of course, that's the only way. That's the only way it could have worked, is by using the Commedia dell'arte techniques." Now, Commedia dell'arte is one of the oldest, longest running forms of theatre. I mean, it was a form of theatre that lasted for about 400 years. And so by the time the mid to late 16th century came around, it was incredibly, it must have been incredibly codified, and a huge amount of experience handed down from generation to generation. And so what this obviously tells me is that there is much closer relationship to early modern theatre, to Commedia dell'arte, than to modern theatrical techniques. which of course blows out of the water all the intellectual thinking that goes on when it comes to talking about and in far too many cases, in my mind, performing Shakespeare, because that intellectualism, whilst those pieces, whilst those plays, and especially the speeches, sometimes contain the most amazing philosophy, in fact, they would have been delivered on stage in much the same way as commedia dell'arte performances were. And this also has an effect on how the audiences of the time viewed what they were watching on stage, because Richard Burbage was not being Hamlet. He was playing Hamlet, which implies a style of performance which is much more demonstrative rather than intellectual. I suppose in modern terms, the closest we probably would get to it is Brecht, and the theatre of alienation, not getting the audience, well, it's sort of the opposite of Chekhov. Strindberg, where if it's performed well, there is so much subtext, and that you really get into almost completely believing that what you're seeing is a certain sort of reality, almost in a filmic sense, whereas the players were speaking directly to the audience, and they would hide behind a tree and not be visible to the other characters, where in fact they would have been just standing behind a pillar. And the willing suspension of disbelief goes very much further than we have become accustomed to in a post-Freudian intellectual view of theatre.
Yes, there sounds like there would be quite a lot in that we may not like that much today, given our taste for naturalism and realism.
I'm not so sure, because when we speak of horses, that you see them. So I am now going to say this is a horse. Okay. If you take Peter Schaffer's Equus, for example, nobody believes that those are real horses. They are representational.
And representational on a scale as well for a big theatre. It's interesting that you're talking about Shakespeare having come out of other traditions, because we tend to think of him as being right at the beginning of this huge thing that is early modern theatre. But also he is coming out of a long tradition of medieval theatre, an almost equally long, not quite as long one of commedia dell'arte, you would say as well. And when we spoke before, we mentioned the interlude as a very specific thing as part of the development of what became public theatre, because I think that's where we start to get this mix of the more intimate sort of performance that was done during a meal and as part of an interlude in a banquet. But we get this mixture of the public and the intimate and the large scale and the small scale coming together in these early modern plays, and in Shakespeare in particular, it seems to me. And maybe that's part of the genius, is that he could merge all of these things into pieces that really spoke to his audience and somehow still managed to speak to us today.
It's not the same as pageants as pageants, because that would have been something else. That would have been sort of hugely spectacular, and one of is sort of an analogy, but I'm a great fan of Peter Schaffer, by the way. There's a moment in Amadeus when Salieri, when Mozart is going to be presented to the emperor for the first time, and Salieri, of course, as the court composer, composes a little march for accompany Mozart's entry into the emperor's presence. He plays that as Mozart comes in. I mean, if you see it in the film, I mean, I worked on the stage play, but if the clip is available on YouTube on the film, from the film. And so Salieri plays his little march. Mozart comes in and is presented to the emperor. And the emperor says, "What did you think of Salieri's piece that he wrote for you?" And Mozart then sits down at the piano and plays the whole thing from memory, and then says, "Well, this bit doesn't really work, does it? How about if we change that to this?" So he's played Salieri's piece from memory, being the genius that he is, and then proceeds to completely revamp it and turn it into something absolutely amazing to listen to. F. Murray Abraham as Salieri is brilliant in his reaction as an actor, but I equate Shakespeare to Mozart because they both did something. Well, they both changed what was the standard form and were pioneers in their own way. And they were probably, I mean, Shakespeare was certainly a plagiarist. I mean, there is absolutely no doubt about that. I mean, all the academics and scholars and everybody have identified the source text for just about all of the plays, with the possible exception of Merry Wives. Although there is some debate about that too. Shakespeare would I actually use the line in the play. Young Will could take a poor play and turn it into a great one in a matter of weeks, if not days. And that's what he was. He was a playwright, and he wrote plays. Where he got his source material from, well, Peter Schaffer got his source material for Amadeus from, I think it's Dostoevsky, wrote a similar play. Certainly one of them Russian guys, and adapted it and made it into a play that we all know. Is it better? Well, we would probably think so because it's related to our culture.
But none of that, none of being steeped in the past of your art or getting your source material from somewhere would take away from Shakespeare being an absolute genius, in your opinion?
Absolutely not. To me, Shakespeare is one of those great artists, like Mozart, like Beethoven, like Leonardo da Vinci, high up in the summit of their art. But the art is playwriting. It's not the philosophy. It's certainly not the literature. God knows we have seen so many performances of Shakespeare which are literature on stage, where the entire theatricality has been sacrificed to literature. It's non-literature. And if Shakespeare wanted to write literature, he could have written books where he wrote poems. I always wonder how much he would be, if he hadn't written the plays, how much the sonnets would be known. I mean, the two, Rape of Lucrece and the Venus and Adonis, are absolutely amazingly powerful in and of themselves, but they're incredibly theatrical. So they're sort of poem plays. But when it comes to the sonnets, I often wonder how much of a poet Shakespeare would be considered as now, because, and this is obviously highly personal, but as a poet, I much prefer John Donne and Spenser and the poets of the time. I find that this may be sacrilege, and some people might run screaming. And I mean, I find the sonnets Again, one has to look at it from the perspective of the time. The sonnet at that period was kind of the equivalent of the pop song of our time. Now, I mean, you have pop folk singers like Bob Dylan, like Leonard Cohen, like Bruce Springsteen, who write. I mean, their songs are poems and works of art. You then have some other pop singers whose work is perhaps of a less enduring validity.
And I assume you'd agree that the fact that Shakespeare was a man of the practical theatre, both in terms of being an actor and a proprietor of a theatre, absolutely feeds into all of the plays and makes them pieces to be performed.
Well, yes. Why did Shakespeare write plays? Well, basically to make money. But yes, I mean, he had a knack. I'm working on a theory, and I'm trying to do the research. Is that actually quite early on in his career, probably very early on in his career, he discovered he had a knack for adaptation, and that is why his incredibly fast rise to fame. Dare I say it? He wasn't actually creating anything. He was taking a play by Thomas Kyd, or he was taking a play by Marlowe, or others, and adapting them and rewriting them and turning them into the most amazing pieces of work, like Mozart and Salieri, which is why I like that analogy. There is extant a supposedly anonymous interlude stroke play called The Famous Victories of Henry V, which was actually printed even before Shakespeare was born. And this has come down to us in printed form. And the scholars and the experts have studied it, and they found that great whole sections of The Famous Victories of Henry V turn up in Henry IV and Henry V. Absolutely word for word. I mean, it's just simply lifted and sufficiently well, or I say word for word. I mean, it's been changed into, it's been adapted as only Shakespeare can adapt into a play. But I mean, there is absolutely no question that this interlude series of playlets, which is also a play called The Famous Victories of Henry V, anonymous, so certain scenes in Henry IV and Henry V, mostly Henry IV.
Even working like that, though, if he was saving himself some time in the writing, he must have been a complete workaholic. I mean, writing and running a theatre and acting and producing so much in those particular short years.
I don't know how much he was actually running the theatre. He was a shareholder, yes, but I think most of the sort of day-to-day management would have been done by John Hemmings.
Like all good geniuses, he had a good team behind him.
Well, yeah. I don't see him actually from everything I've looked, everything I've read, everything I've studied. I don't see him actually as the leader of the company. He was a member of the company, and the shareholders, Alexander Pope and Gussie Phillips and all the others, were equal shareholders. It was a cooperative. He just happened to be the one providing the plays, but we hold Arthur Miller in revere, in reverence, because of the amazing plays he wrote. Because we are so focused on the literary stroke authorship side of things, and so you have great 20th century playwrights like Harold Pinter, like Samuel Beckett, like Peter Shaffer, my personal favorite. Let me put it this way. Let's take the film Gone with the Wind. So the book is famous. and the book was sold in many copies and so on. And then it was made into a film. Who wrote the screenplay?
Don't know.
No, nobody knows. Well, actually, I mean, it's not nobody knows. If you Google deep enough, you can find it. And this man who wrote the screenplay for Gone with the Wind also had a couple of plays. I have done the research, and I found his name, and I can't remember it now. But he also had a couple of plays produced on Broadway. But who gives a damn who wrote the screenplay for Gone with the Wind? And one of the, we don't talk about the deniers, but one of the deniers' arguments is that nobody paid any attention when Shakespeare died in Stratford. Well, would anybody pay attention? Screenwriter for Gone with the Wind when he died. Actually, I discovered he having made quite a lot of money, he retired to a farm in upstate New York, and he died when he was ploughing a field, and his tractor fell over and fell on him, and he died under the tractor, all alone in the middle of a field.
Oh, that's a grisly end. Sidney Howard is the name we were looking for there. And you're right, you do have to go fairly deep into the article about Gone with the Wind to find him.
I do not believe for an instant that Shakespeare believed his plays were immortal. I think he was a jobbing playwright who was writing damn good plays which appealed to the public and got the punters in. And the Chamberlain's men were extremely successful, basically because they had a repertoire of good plays. Did the public know who was writing those plays? Did the public actually care? Did Queen Elizabeth care? Well, there is an extant document where she commissions the Chamberlain's men for two plays. One is The Merry Wives, because she liked the character of Falstaff so much, and the other is Twelfth Night. That letter commissioning a play for the 6th of January is sometime round about the middle of December, which means that he wrote Twelfth Night in a fortnight, which does kind of explain the ending, because the ending is pretty lumpy. It's very Deus Ex Machina, But if he wrote the damn thing in 2 weeks, then one can forgive him that. And the beginning and the end are always the most difficult of any work of art. In fact, be it a book or a play. I mean, it's always the beginning and the end which are the most difficult. The end even more so than the beginning, because you could start with an idea and have no idea where it's going, which is kind of the best writing anyway. But you have to end it. You have to find an end. You have to create an end. And if you're under a 2 to 3 week deadline, then
they almost certainly didn't have the reverence for the playwright that we often have today. And they would have just continued to see him as a jobbing playwright who was producing, the play you went to see next week, and then the following week or two after that, there was another one.
Yeah. And they were good plays, so great. Carole King wrote a huge number of very popular songs. It wasn't until very late in her career that she actually started to sing them in public. But I think she was into her 40s or 50s before she actually started singing herself. And anybody outside the business itself, anybody actually heard of her?
I suppose it's related to this, this absolute fascination that we have with Shakespeare and all the research that's been done, all the minutiae that we pick over the life. That kind of, is that accentuating more than we need to know about him, really? I mean, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, does it? As long as the plays are good and we're still finding things that are new in them to talk about?
Well, yeah. It leads to something which I find rather frustrating, because it does blind us to the fact that he was a genius playwright, period, and and a good poet. And it becomes a sort of deification of the man. How could this man have had all this knowledge? Well, quite frankly, he stole it.
And perhaps that just makes him more human at the end of the day.
Well, it also, I mean, for me, it also makes his genius more individual, because his genius is in the plays. And this is something that I take issue with scholars very, very often, is that they don't look at what is actually written. They look at what's behind it. And, one of the things about one of the main genius for me with Shakespeare is that given that the performers were working, the players were working only from cue scripts, everything the player needs to know to create his character must be in his own lines. Now that, to create such incredibly deep, profound, human characters, given that restriction, that's genius.